Welcome to Hub History, the show that brings you fascinating stories from Boston history. This is episode 14, Go in Peace or Go in Pieces. Hi, I'm Jake.
And I'm Nikki. And this week, we're going to kick off Black History Month a little early with a feature on Lewis Hayden, an abolitionist, businessman, and politician who escaped slavery and became the conductor of a well-trafficked stop on the Underground Railroad on the north slope of Beacon Hill.
But first, it's time to take a look at what's coming up this week in Boston history.
Monday is January 30th, and that marks the anniversary of the 1769 fire in Boston's jail. Two inmates, a soldier and a young boy, had set fire to their cell door in an escape attempt. However, the flames soon grew out of control and the jailers had misplaced their keys. The exterior doors were made of thick oaken planks bound in iron, so it took quite some time to break through into the jail with axes. Two prisoners were badly burned, and others were injured in the rescue. The jail building was a total loss. British soldiers and sailors pitched in on the effort to save injured prisoners and douse the flames. Some would say it was the only constructive action they took during the occupation years. We'll link to accounts of the fire in the show notes this week at hubhistory.com/014.
On January 31st, 1894, the former leader of Canada's Liberal Party and current Irish Nationalist Member of Parliament spoke in Boston. Edward Blake, along with Boston's Mayor Nathan Matthews, spoke to dignitaries gathered at Boston Music Hall in favor of Irish Home Rule. Under this proposal, Ireland would remain within the United Kingdom, but with increased local autonomy. In Blake's words, an Irish legislature is to be established, and an Irish executive set up responsible to that legislature. That this Irish legislature is to have control over all exclusively Irish affairs, including the land, education, police, judiciary, the administration of justice, property, and civil rights, municipal institutions, local development, the thousand things which affect the daily life of the people. Not merely is Ireland to make her own laws on these vital subjects, but she is also to administer those laws. This Irish nationalist message found an enthusiastic audience amongst the increasingly Irish-American population of Boston.
Wednesday is February 1st, and on February 1st, 1948, the governor released the Master Highway Plan for the Boston metropolitan area. This is a document that you have to see to believe, so we'll have a copy in the show notes. It proposed highways everywhere. Along with Route 128 and the Southeast Expressway, it included the now abandoned plans for the Southwest Expressway and Inner Belt, as well as a freeway along the banks of the Charles. But you know what it didn't include? Public transit.
On February 2nd, 1794, Abigail Adams wrote to John with her true feelings about Alexander Hamilton. I think very little honor is due to his head and none to his heart. I am sorry he's called to fill so important an office as the one to which he is lately appointed. His ideas are many of them derived from the gambling table, and his illusions from a brothel, which he coarsely distributes without respect to his readers. Neither Adams was ever much of a fan of Hamilton's.
Friday is February 3rd, and that is the date in 1690 when the Massachusetts Bay Colony issued the first paper money in the Americas. The colony needed to raise money to pay for King William's War. Since early 1688, Massachusetts had been fighting New France from southern Maine to the St. Lawrence River. The colony was short on silver coins and had an army to pay, so the Crown authorized the legislature to print bills of credit. These notes were redeemable for hard currency at a later time and could be used to pay any public or private debt. The ongoing shortage of gold and silver in the colonies, as well as the convenience of paper money, meant that similar bills became very popular in the decades to come.
On February 4th, we wish a happy birthday to Josiah Quincy III, born in 1772. He would grow up to be the mayor of Boston, a congressman, and president of Harvard. Today he's mostly remembered as the namesake of Quincy Market, which he championed during his administration. Finally, Sunday is February 5th. Do you ever notice the signs along Route 128 designating it as Yankee Division Highway? The Yankee Division was the 26th Infantry Division of the Massachusetts National Guard. As the U.S. entered World War I, the unit went through months of training in 1917, then deployed to Europe in early 1918. On February 5, 1918, at Chemin-des-Dames in eastern France, Battery A of the 101st Field Artillery fired a 75mm gun. It was the first shot fired by a Massachusetts unit in the First World War. That first shell casing was brought home and later displayed in the Massachusetts State House.
And now we turn to our main topic for the week. Lewis Hayden was born into slavery in Kentucky in 1811 or 1816, depending on the source. His mother was of mixed race, including African, European, and Native American ancestry. This is of note because slavery of Native Americans was banned by this time. If a woman could show direct maternal Native American ancestry, she would have had grounds for a freedom suit for herself and her children.
This matrilineal system was due to the doctrine of partus sequitur ventrum, which translates to that which is brought forth follows the womb. The principle was adopted by the slave states in the 17th century. As such, children of white women and Native American women were born free.
Hayden was first owned by a Presbyterian minister who sold off his brothers and sisters in preparation for moving to Pennsylvania, a state where slavery was prohibited. Hayden was traded for 2 carriage horses to a traveling salesman. Ironically, the minister was a distant relative of the abolitionist and conductor John Rankin, who will show up later in this episode. In a short autobiographical text prepared for Harriet Beecher Stowe's Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, Hayden wrote, "There may be ministers and professors of religion who think it is more wrong to separate the families of slaves by sale than to separate any domestic animals, but I never met with them. It may seem strange, but it is a fact. I had more sympathy and kind advice in my efforts to get my freedom from gamblers and such men than Christians." Being owned by someone who traveled so much allowed Hayden to hear varying opinions of slavery and introduced him to the notion that slavery was considered a crime by many. I've seen mention of a pretty extraordinary happening on these travels. Supposedly, when Lewis was 14, the Marquis de Lafayette tipped his hat to him while visiting Kentucky. I'm not sure that this happened, but if it did, you can imagine that it would have had a lasting impact and given him a sense of self-worth. In the mid-1830s, Hayden married Esther Harvey, but she and their son were soon sold to U.S. Senator Henry Clay, who sold them both to the Deep South. Hayden never saw his family again, and in 1840 he was sold at auction. He was purchased by a man who regularly whipped his slaves to control them, yet Hayden was able to teach himself to read using newspapers and a Bible.
In 1842, he married again, this time to a woman named Harriet Bell. Harriet had a 5-year-old son named Joseph, and Hayden raised him as a stepson. But now with a family, and afraid that they could be separated again at any time, Hayden began to actively seek out ways to secure his freedom. Hayden approached other men, asking them to buy him and proposing that they hire him out for fees to return their investment, but asking them to allow Hayden to keep some earnings and purchase his freedom. The men were Lewis Baxter, an insurance office clerk, and Thomas Grant, an oil manufacturer and tallow chandler, and they did buy him. The men hired Hayden out to work at Lexington's Phoenix Hotel, where he started to save his share of the earnings for future freedom. In the fall of 1844, Hayden met Calvin Fairbank, a Methodist minister who was studying at Oberlin College, and Delia Webster.
It's worth noting that Fairbank was a really remarkable man who spent a total of 19 years in prison for his work freeing slaves. He was not an abolitionist who stayed comfortable giving lectures in northern cities. He was a man of action, and he freed as many as 47 individuals. And Webster, for her work as a conductor, became the first woman to be imprisoned for assisting fugitive slaves.
So the Haydens were in good hands. If ever they were to escape, this was going to be it. It's believed that Webster financed the trip, and she and Fairbank acquired a carriage to travel with the Haydens. The group set off on September 28, 1844. The Haydens covered their faces with flour to appear white, and at times of danger, they would hide Joseph under the seat. They traveled the Maysville-Lexington Turnpike, their ultimate destination being the home of Reverend John Rankin in Ripley, Ohio, which was just across the Ohio River. Rankin was a well-known conductor in the Underground Railroad.
And he was the cousin of Lewis's former owner, who had traded him for the carriage horses.
The Haydens were left safely in Ripley, and they made their way to Canada. As they returned to Kentucky after leaving the Haydens, Webster and Fairbank were accosted by angry slave owners and a livery stable operator before they reached Lexington. Webster's landlady had searched her room during her absence and found incriminating letters linking her to abolitionists and to the Underground Railroad. Webster was arrested for assisting runaway slaves. Authorities also found damning evidence on Fairbank, and he was arrested. The driver of their carriage, a slave named Israel, was beaten until he admitted what they had done. Fairbank was sentenced to a 15-year term in the Kentucky State Penitentiary, 5 years for each of the slaves he had helped free. In 1849, Lewis Hayden raised $650, which was demanded by his former master, which allowed Fairbank to be pardoned by the governor.
Delia Webster also had an interesting journey after the arrest, and I think it's worth deviating a little bit to tell her story. Funds were raised for her defense from Vermont, her state of birth, and her attorneys managed to win her a separate trial since most of the evidence pointed toward Fairbank. Webster pled not guilty, but she was convicted in December 1844 and sentenced to 2 years in the state prison. Because she was the only female prisoner, she was housed in a wooden cottage in the center of the prison yard. The warden was Captain Newton Craig, and he was closely related to several of her enemies, including his cousin Parker Craig, the livery stable owner from whom Fairbank rented the carriage. Craig was a strong advocate of slavery, and he regularly delivered evangelical sermons to his inmates. And yet, he was smitten by Delia Webster, and they presumably became lovers. He urged the governor to pardon her, and after 5 weeks she was released. Now, after Webster was pardoned, she did not contact Craig again. Yet, he continued to write to her, begging her to return to Kentucky, and later he would help finance a farm that she purchased.
Now, back to the Haydens. From Canada, they moved in 1845 to Detroit, in the Free State of Michigan. As a gateway to Canada, it was a major center for fugitive slaves. While there, Hayden founded a school for black children, as well as the Church of the Colored Methodist Society. But deciding he wanted to be at the center of anti-slavery activity, by January 1846, Hayden and his family moved to Boston, which had many residents who strongly supported abolitionism. After getting settled at 66 Phillips Street on Beacon Hill, Hayden owned and ran a clothing store on Cambridge Street. The Haydens regularly took in fugitive slaves. It's thought that some 25% of the escaped slaves who traveled through Boston passed through the Phillips Street home. By far the most well-known guests were William and Ellen Craft. The Crafts had escaped from the South on a passenger train headed north. Ellen was light-skinned, and she played the role of a Southern gentleman, while William acted as her personal servant. The Crafts toured the United States, Canada, and Great Britain, speaking against slavery, and they became celebrated public figures. While they were still living in Boston, slave catchers were sent to reclaim the Crafts. The Vigilance Committee, of which Hayden was a member, stepped up to ensure the Crafts' safety. Ellen was sent to Brookline, and William was hidden in the Hayden house. The windows were barricaded, the locks were reinforced, and a group of African-American men were hired to protect the house. In the event that all security measures failed, Hayden had stored a keg of gunpowder in the house. He was prepared to blow up the house if slave catchers entered, rather than to surrender Craft. He's said to have remarked, "They will go in peace, or they will go in pieces." Fortunately, it didn't come to that. Boston was not yet a hospitable environment for slave catchers, and they eventually left.
Just 4 months later, Hayden became involved in another high-profile act of resistance involving the escaped slave Shadrach Minkins, which will be the topic of next week's episode. And Lewis had many remarkable accomplishments in addition to his role as a conductor. During the Civil War, he recruited African-American men for the 54th Regiment. He also served in the Massachusetts House of Representatives and worked for the Massachusetts Secretary of State. For her part, Harriet outlived Lewis, and at her passing, her estate was contributed to the endowment at Harvard Medical School to set up scholarships for African American students. We believe that this is the only endowment contribution to a university made by a formerly enslaved person.
If you want to learn more about Lewis and Harriet Hayden, check out this week's show notes at hubhistory.com/014. We'll have a link to Harvard's website for the Lewis and Harriet Hayden Scholarship for Colored Students. We'll also post a link to the National Parks website for information on the Boston African American National Historic Site, where visitors can take a heritage tour through Beacon Hill, including the Lewis and Harriet Hayden House. It's a great time to support our national parks. And finally, we'll have a link to a book that may be of interest to anyone wanting to learn more about the people of the Underground Railroad, and it's called People of the Underground Railroad, a Biographical Dictionary.
If you want to get in touch with us, we're on Facebook at facebook.com/hubhistory, and our Twitter handle is @hubhistory. You can email us at podcast@hubhistory.com or go to hubhistory.com and click on the Contact Us link. While you're there, be sure to click on the subscribe link to see all the ways to subscribe to the show. If we're not on your favorite podcast app, drop us a line to let us know.
That's all for now. We'll be back next time with a show about the rescue of Shadrach Minkins and Boston's resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act.